think we all look for ways to grow when it comes to our art, whether it's watercolor or acrylics, and at some point you will reach a stage where simply painting a realistic shape may no longer be as satisfying, and you will want to push for something more intriguing and more challenging. I found one of the best ways to do this is to approach a familiar subject in a different light and try to capture the variation of colors and reflections in a new way. In this video, I will show you how to paint a flower that you've probably seen me paint a few times before, but we're going to introduce some more advanced watercolor techniques and try to really capture the evening sun reflecting off those rose petals. I will take you through the process and you will see the entire painting unfold layer by layer, but I want to also give you the behind the scenes of what's going on and explain why I use certain watercolor techniques to help you understand how you can paint a different kind of light on your favorite subjects. We will cover the underpainting technique, pigment selection from cool to warm, softening the edges, both small and large, and layering the shadows. You will also hear me talk quite a bit about the background, but if you want to know more about this specific watercolor technique, I recommend watching this tutorial from a few weeks ago where I summarized watercolor background techniques in detail. I will leave a link down in the video description below. Don't forget to subscribe if you feel like you're getting value out of this video. All materials are listed in the video description below, and you will also find a link to my reference photo there. For my Patreon supporters, I created 2 black and white outlines, one with shadows and one without, so you can download both and practice, and you will also find a real-time, not sped up recording version of this video on my Patreon. It's about 3 hours long, not counting the drying breaks between the layers. So let's get started. In step 1, we're going to cover some of the areas of the rose with a very light layer of warm yellow. Your painting should end up looking something like this by the end of this step. The reason why this step is important is because if we want to achieve this warm, glowing light effect, we want to take full advantage of watercolor transparency and have the pure warm yellow shining through our base pink petal color and also through our shadows as we layer them on top. Simply mixing it into your pink will create a muddy effect. You can try this yourself and you will see it's simply not working the same way when done in one layer. Also, the shape of the yellow highlight will be broken if we try to paint it separately by mixing different colors on different petals. So this underpainting step is key, and you will see how it turns out in just a minute. You don't have to get it precisely in the spots that I do, but examine the reference photo and add the yellow at the base of most petals. The reason why we don't add yellow to the tips is because the tips are super thin, have very little natural color, and in this kind of evening light scenario without much sunlight, they look almost blue, especially those on the left. The technique we're going to use is called wet on wet, meaning we will pre-wet the paper and then drop the yellow pigment roughly where we see the light hitting the flower. So let's wet the petals first with clear water and then follow with our yellow. Notice that I didn't cover the entire area of the flower with clear water. I left some parts on the left completely dry because I don't want any yellow to spread into those areas. There's no sunlight there. For the most part, the yellow highlights will be on the top petals on the right-hand side. That's direct sunlight coming from a very low angle of the setting sun. And we will also need some yellow at the base of the petals on the right-hand side and a bit in the center. This is warm light that is passing through the petals on the higher tier and hitting the ones underneath. I will be using Hansa Yellow Deep from Daniel Smith. You can also use something like Diarylite Yellow from Core or any of your favorite warm medium yellows from the brand you prefer. Now that our underpainting layer is completely dry, I gave it about 6 hours. Let's do our first layer of color. We will start here and by the end of it have something like this, much more realistic but very light, no shadows yet. So not quite there yet, but we will have a general idea of the type of warm and cool colors that are going to be dominant on this rose. and it will be our map of color, so to speak, our guide for the final layers as we are working to build value and saturation slowly. So this is a good opportunity to discuss the pigment choices. Our rose is pink, and so let that be our main pigment. I use quinacridone red from Quor, and we will use it to build around the spectrum towards more warm colors like pyrrole orange, and those will be largely concentrated on the right where we have the sun, and we also have cool pigments like purple, and I used dioxazine purple, and blue, I used Winsor blue red shade on the left, and on the shadows, of course. Cooler pigments look further away, lacking the light when placed next to warm pigments. So this is why we have this sort of spread from warm to cool. It will help us create a great sense of contrast and temperature and make that highlighted part in the middle of the flower really pop. So keep in mind, there is this general shift in color temperature we're trying to reflect from left to right. And we will also have some subtle color variations within each petal. So even the cooler purple petals on the left-hand side and on top will have a subtle gradient, which we will create wet on wet using purple on the edges and pink towards the base of the petal. And the warmer petals on the right-hand side won't have any blue edges. We will just use our base pink color and then transition all the way towards the base of the petal using a warmer pink, like say quinacridone coral or even pyrrole orange like I did here. Pay close attention to this one petal at the front. It has a very complex layer of shadows, and you can see I first covered it with a light layer of quin red with some blue and purple on the edges, leaving that yellow highlight in the middle. And I then followed with a much more concentrated quinacridone coral on the left and on the right, making sure that coral doesn't spread into the highlight. Some petals in the middle area are a bit more complicated as they will contain both pinks and some purple shadows. Just look closely at the reference photo and use your best judgment to try and match the color. For the most part, I started with a very light layer of pink, or my quinacridone red to be more specific, for the middle petals, and added purple where the shadows are. The next area I painted was the flower on the right-hand side, much more muted, using quinacridone red and some perylene violet, finishing off with some green on that large petal. I want to see it fade in the background, so that's why I introduced the green and blended it all the way down into the background area. So this is my tip number 2 for painting light. This is what we call to soften an edge, and it is extremely useful when you want to take attention away from a certain area. Simply extend your surrounding color into the subject using a very light wash. It will help you blend your object with the background, and you can do it a few times with a few layers depending on how much you want that area to stand out or not to stand out at all. You will see me do it many times throughout this painting, as I will be blending the left side of the rose into the background by covering the left petals with blue pigment and extending it into the background. I also quickly added a bit of warm yellow mixed with brown into the middle of the flower, creating a warm shadow and a starting point for the stamens, which we will paint later. I finished off by doing the background on the left. If you've seen my in-depth tutorial on watercolor backgrounds, you will recognize this technique. This first layer will have wet on wet splashes of color, and I will gradually make it darker as we come back to it over and over again. Just like with our rose, this first layer of the background is just to establish the overall color scheme. No details at this point. I recommend reusing a lot of colors that you've already used on the flower. Like I'm applying the same Winsor blue red shade that I used on the petals, although here it's much more saturated. And I'm also using Perylene Violet and Dioxazine Purple, which we have already used. As I'm transitioning to the right, I will start introducing green to warm it up and add a little bit of visual interest as we move towards that rose in the background on the right. Here you can just reuse your warm green and maybe add some blue into it to cool it off, or just use a more muted green straight from the tube, something like aqua green from Winsor & Newton. I may eventually add a much warmer green like sap green or even olive green. Again, for this, I really think you can easily mix your own using your yellow and blue and play with different proportions. The warmer greens, wet on wet, will just indicate or suggest some leaves and branches in the background. We will come back to this area later. Notice the edge blending technique again. I extended my warm blue, my Winsor blue red shade, into the petals on the left and blended the background and the foreground. When this layer is dry, let's do the stamens using your warm brown. And here you can reuse the Perylene Maroon, mix it with yellow, or you can also use something like quinacridone burnt orange, or if you're using Winsor & Newton, you can go with brown matter. And now the exciting and probably the most challenging part, as we will paint the first layer of shadows. We will start with this and work towards something like this. You can help yourself by mapping them out with a pencil, or if you're feeling more confident, you can just go in with your brush and draw the shadows as you see them in the reference photo. My Patreon supporters will find a separate file with shadow outlines in this lesson. We're going to use a bit more saturated color scheme, but the same pigments as the ones we've used before. So some shadows will be very warm, like this first one I'm painting here, and I'm using quinacridone coral. You can use one of your warmer pinks, or you can use your base red and mix a little bit of orange into it. But mostly, of course, we will use blues and purples, especially on the left-hand side. Some shadows are going to be very sharp and defined, while others, mostly on the left, will cover the entire petal because, well, the entire flower is in the shadow there. So we are building our values slowly here, and we'll go over each petal, making sure we cover the areas that are not in direct sunlight with a very thin, very diluted layer of color. My tip number 3 is for layering the shadows. Notice that some shadows I'm painting extend over several petals. This is absolutely key as we want to achieve true realistic sense of light. The shadows that come from any specific shape, like a petal, tend to fall over multiple objects. And so we need to treat them as a whole, painting them in one go without breaking the shape of each shadow. Which is why you will see me a lot of times carrying one shadow from petal to petal without any breaks in between. In some cases, like here, the shadow will start very sharp and defined on one petal and then slowly blend into the background as I transition to the next petal. And I blend with clear water, of course. Some shadows will have a very defined palette, like purple only, and others, especially here, will have multiple color areas. It helps to work these wet on wet. Notice that I've added some pyrrole orange in some of the shadows on the right to really make them glow. And then I painted another layer on the background using a variation of blues and greens. You don't need to use such a variety. I will be the first one to admit that I tend to overdo it by extending my palette. Not everyone likes this kind of look. It's not particularly realistic, but I do. I like to exaggerate my color variations. So for the blues, I used Winsor blue and indigo. For greens, I used Perylene green, some olive green. I also used my dioxazine purple. And I would recommend just picking one deep blue and one cool green and sticking to that if you don't want to use such an extended palette. But if you do, have fun with it and use your favorites. You can also mix your greens by using yellow and blue, of course. Once again, I softened the edge on that large petal on the right simply by extending my background color into it. And I finished off by applying some Perylene Violet and Quinacridone Red on the rest of the rose. That's it for this step. Now let's let it dry. I gave it a day here, but I think 3-4 hours would be enough just to make sure that your paper is completely dry, and we can move on to the next layer. Our rose is looking a bit more realistic now, and it will be time to define the shadows in the next step. Okay, so this step is all about accentuating areas of light and dark and really defining our shadows. We will start here and end up with something like this. Most of our shadows on the petals will require a bit more color to build more value. In other words, to make them darker and more saturated. And the key techniques I'm using here are wet on wet, again, just building more colors on top of previously painted shadows, and blending, where I put a bit more saturated color in the darkest area of the shadow, for example, immediately at the base of the petal, and then I blend it out with clear water. You can see in some cases I will be washing the brush and then getting rid of excess water by tapping it on tissue paper and just helping my color blend with that semi-wet brush. I will also paint some smaller shadow details that we didn't include in the previous layer. The pigments are the same for the most part, but I also start introducing more and more of my Perylene Violet into some shadows. It will make them look a lot more sharp. A few more details on this layer, like the small rosebud on the right, and I will use my warm red, my Quinacridone Coral here. Some green details in the center of the flower, using negative painting technique to outline those small yellow stamens and add more definition to the brown ones with the tip of my brush. I have a detailed tutorial on negative painting on my YouTube channel, and I will link it in the video description below, but essentially negative painting includes painting around a subject as opposed to painting on the subject. So here I'm just using the tip of my brush to go around those little circular shapes. And we're done with this step, leaving us with something much more realistic. And you can already recognize the shapes of the petals, some key shadows. There's a lot more volume. We have a nice warm glow in the middle. From this point on, the only way to work on this flower is to build on what we already have and to add more value and more contrast between light and dark and between cool and warm pigments. Next, I went over the left side of the painting and put down a layer of purple and blue, covering the background and extending that color all the way to the bottom tier of petals. This is an important step, as we want to make sure that this part of the rose on the left fully blends into the background. Essentially, we're softening that entire left edge between the flower and the background. I then used my Perylene Violet, a little bit of purple and magenta to add more value to our shadows. Basically, I went over every petal and looked at every shadow I painted and added just a little bit more saturation on the darkest parts. Mainly, these darker parts will be concentrated immediately under the petals, and I blended them towards the edge of each petal with clear water. And in some cases, especially on the right-hand side, we will need to add more definition to these sharper, smaller shadows. Lastly, we have an opportunity to add more glow to the shadows on the right that have some beautiful warm backlight. And I use my transparent orange and also my yellow Hansa Yellow Deep to be more specific, to add a little bit more warm color there. On this petal with more complex highlights, you can see I added Hansa Yellow Deep and extended that highlight with the tip of my brush to create some thin lines, just a little bit of texture. This petal at the front needed a little bit more blue and a bit more work in general on the shadows, so that's what I did there. And then I wanted to add more value and definition to the background flower. I used my base pink, so quinacridone red, and maybe you're using something else like quinacridone rose, but essentially use that base pink color and maybe add a little bit of brownish reddish violet. I used a combination of perylene violet and perylene maroon, and you can just simply use a warm brown here with your base red. And I glazed these colors slowly over the background rose, making sure it is receding into the background, becoming darker compared to that petal of the front rose that's immediately on top. Our goal here is to make sure the petal covering the background rose is much more bright and has more detail, bringing it forward visually. A bit of olive green on that background spot and a bit of quinacridone coral. You can use any warm pink, even something like Scarlet Lake on the small rosebud. I used my tiniest synthetic brush in size 00. It's a fairly cheap brush from KUM Germany. You can use any of your favorite synthetics in size 000 to paint darker details on the stamens with my perylene maroon. So use any warm brown here, and any thin round synthetic brush will do. I spent a little bit more time on the petals in the center, just making sure I had more detail, because you've heard me say this before, the more detail we add, the closer and more interesting that portion of the painting will appear. So because we want the center of the flower to draw the eye, we want the lines and details to be extra sharp in that area. A few more finishing touches, some warm highlights using quinacridone coral, and adding more depth and saturation using perylene green on that background spot. I added another layer to the background, but this time creating some vague organic details using a negative painting technique. You can see a full tutorial on this technique in this video, which I will link in the video description. But essentially, I drew some leaves and branches with my pencil and then used my brush to paint around the shapes with darker color. Doing this allows me to keep the leaf shapes lighter, so basically same value as my previous layer, making the background darker. So these details kind of pop out of the background of the darkness, but there's not a lot of contrast. So overall, the background remains like one solid block of color, but there's some detail there, some visual interest. In other words, more detail and more visual interest without overwhelming the rose in the center of the composition. I used perylene green and indothrone blue from Core, but you can stick to your original blue. In my case, it was Winsor blue red shade that you've used on petals, just make it a few shades darker. And I added a bit more color on the rosebud leaves, olive green as base and some of my brown on the tips. Watercolors tend to look lighter when they dry out, so here I noticed that the petals looked a bit lighter than I wanted them to on the left. So I added another glaze of purple and my base pink color. Use your best judgment. By this point, you may be already ready to wrap it up if the painting is starting to look overworked, but I kept my glazes so light that I felt like I could still add just one more. The last thing I did, which is entirely optional, is add just a few veins on the petals with the smallest brush I have and just a little bit of pink, mostly only on the front-facing petals that are closer to us. And this was the final result. I peeled off my masking tape. I'm very impressed with the fact that my 140-pound cold pressed paper didn't buckle. Certainly having it in the block plus having some strong masking tape on top helps. And here's our rose, a very different look as we've worked on not just the petal shapes and building realistic volume there, but also on the different types of light, from cool on the left to warm in the center, and back to dark and cool on the right. Hope you found this video useful. Try using these techniques on your favorite subject and let me know what you discover as you experiment with different types of light. Once again, a real-time recording of this video with some additional commentary is available on my Patreon. Huge thank you to everyone who supports my channel through Patreon. With your donations, I'm able to make longer, better tutorials, and I'm extremely grateful for all your contributions. Have a wonderful week ahead. I will see you soon.